All right, so welcome to Functional Mobility. We're going to focus on foundations of functional mobility today. Main thing to think about is the difference between flexibility and mobility. So flexibility focuses on the ability of a muscle or muscle group to reach a range of motion passively, so with support, whereas mobility looks at more the ability of muscles, muscle groups, and joints to achieve a range of motion actively. And so we're going to focus more on that active range of motion and being able to control positions. So by being able to control the position, we're less likely to get hurt in the position because we're able to control and have that strength in that position, and also allows us to achieve those positions actively when we do our activities, whether it's our activities of daily living or our sport. So we're going to go through the foundations today. A couple key things to keep in mind, key concepts that we'll be implementing throughout the class and for classes to come, is breathing and irradiation. So we'll start with some breathing. It's common for us to hold tension in areas, and we can use the breath to increase range of motion, to increase our ability to get into positions by decreasing that neuromuscular stimulus. So sometimes the nervous system creates a little bit of resistance to go into those positions. So breathing throughout these movements and drills is really important. And then we're going to go through something called irradiation, which is creating tension, which sounds counterintuitive, but we'll talk a little bit more about how we'll apply that shortly. So to start, we're going to work on some breathing. The key thing here is to keep your rib cage stacked over your pelvis. So almost imagine a bowl that's upside down, stacked over a bowl that's right side up, and you want to try and get the lips of the bowls touching as much as possible, and that's kind of the rib cage and pelvis. And then we're going to breathe three-dimensionally, so all 360 degrees, trying to get expansion through that lower abdomen and those lower ribs as well. So you can do this in kind of a kneeling position or seated, or even tall kneeling. It's a little easier to get it if you're in more of a seated position, thinking about tucking that pelvis under just a little bit, and then working on that breathing 360 degrees, and trying to inhale and exhale through the nose. And that creates a little bit of resistance through the breath, which helps increase intra-abdominal pressure and creates a bit more stability through our trunk. So we'll just go through a couple of those together. Inhale through the nose and exhale through the nose. And again, seeing is there anywhere where you don't really like to expand, can you bring some more awareness to that area? Good, two more. Inhale through the nose and exhale through the nose. Last one. Inhale through the nose and exhale through the nose. So the next concept that we're going to go through is this irradiation. So basically being able to create tension. And by creating tension actively or on purpose through the body, we can not only allow a little bit of like a reciprocal relaxation. So sometimes if we create tension and then we let go, we can actually come into a more relaxed state. But in the concept of functional mobility, we use this irradiation to essentially create more energy and more focus on the area we're trying to mobilize. So we'll go through just a general irradiation drill. So we'll start on your back, and you can grab a pair of socks or a small ball if it's helpful to get a little bit of feedback, but it's not needed. So we'll lie on your back in kind of a starfish position, and we're going to start with the upper body. And I want you to try and keep that rib and pelvis stack and that 360 breathing as we go through this. But we're going to start by making fists with our hands. So you're creating tension in the hands, and then I want you to flex the wrist to create more tension into the forearm. Straighten the elbows to create tension in the triceps. Then roll those shoulders back and down, creating tension in those shoulder blades. Good. Head and neck nice and long, but then push the back of your head into the ground to create some tension in the back of the neck. Then think about actively tucking your chin towards your throat to bring some tension into the front of the neck. And we're going to hold that for 3, 2, 1. And you can let go. Now we're going to do the same for the lower body. So you're going to start by pointing your toes, curling them under. And if you get a little foot cramp, that's okay, just back off a little bit. Cramping is our body telling us we're not used to the position, so it creates a little bit of what we call neurological confusion. It's a great way to kind of increase our mobility, and we'll talk about this throughout the class. But just back off so you don't get that Charlie horse. Good. Straighten those knees, squeeze those quads, squeeze the bum. So you're almost levitating off the ground. Squeeze, squeeze, squeeze. 3, 2, 1, and let go. Good. Now we're going to do that for the whole body, and then we'll change the intensity. So we'll start again with the upper body. Again, if you have a pair of socks or 2 tennis balls, you can use that for a little bit of feedback. So you're going to squeeze your hands into fists, flex those wrists, straighten those elbows, squeeze those triceps, pull those shoulder blades back and together, squeeze, 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 head and neck nice and long. Now think about pushing your head back into the ground and tucking that chin towards the throat. Then point those toes, curl them under, squeeze those quads to straighten the knees, squeeze the glutes to levitate off the ground, squeeze, squeeze, squeeze. And now I want you to continue squeezing, but come down to about 50% intensity. So if you were doing like a business handshake, that's the intensity you want to squeeze. Couple breaths here. Think about that 3-dimensional expansion. And then squeeze harder. Let's go to 90%. So you're in an arm wrestle with a rock. You're trying to win. Squeeze, squeeze, squeeze. You got this. Keep breathing throughout. Now we're going to go up to about 30% intensity. So like you're shaking the hand of the queen. So a little bit of tension, but not much. Good. Couple breaths. And then let's go back to 80% this time. Squeeze, squeeze, squeeze. And then down to 40%. Last breath, and then squeeze as hard as you can, like you're trying to make juice. Get every little bit of juice out of that orange. You got this. 3, 2, 1, and relax. All right, slowly come out of that into a seated position. So again, the goal is to be able to create tension so that when we're working on one joint, we're not compensating or moving elsewhere. The other thing with playing with the different percentages is our mobility intensity is going to change depending on our goal. So in this class, our goal is to improve mobility. So we're going to work at more that 70 to 90% intensity. But a lot of these exercises you can do at a lower intensity, say 30 to 50%, as a warm-up before your activity, or as a cool down after your activity, or even as just a daily routine to get your joints moving. So depending on your goal or your task, your intensity might change. So we're going to go through what's called controlled articular rotations. And this is where we take each joint through its full rotational capability in a pain-free range. So we'll start with the neck. I want you to imagine a pencil coming out of the top of your head, and you're going to keep the rest of your body still. So if you need to create a little bit of a radiation or tension to keep the rest of the body still, go ahead and do that so that we can really focus on getting that movement through the neck. So you're going to tuck your chin to your chest and imagine that pencil coming over the top of your head, and you're going to roll your right ear to your right shoulder, thinking about drawing a circle on the ceiling, rolling that left ear to left shoulder, and then tucking that chin towards the chest again. Let's do 2 more in this direction, and then we'll switch directions. So I mentioned pain-free range. Sometimes when we work through a full rotation of a joint, let's switch directions, we can get kind of some discomfort or pain or pinching depending on our injury history or our activities. And so I want you to take note of that. And if you have some pain, just back off the range a little bit so you're not going into that pain. Next one we're going to do is for the shoulder. So you're going to make a fist. Again, you can use your ball if you want a little bit of feedback or a little bit more tension. We're going to start with the thumb facing backwards. I like to keep my hand on my rib cage or even in my armpit to get a little bit of feedback, because it's really easy to kind of cheat through the trunk on this one. So I like to keep my hand there so I can feel if I'm kind of compensating a bit. And for this one, you can do in kind of this kneeling position or tall kneeling. It's a little bit more challenging depending on the length of your arm to be fully seated. But you're going to reach up as far as you can. Once you can't go any further, I want you to think about punching the ceiling and like you're screwing something into the ceiling. So now your thumb's pointing back again. From here, you're going to reach back as far as you can to bring your hand towards your hip again, and then we're going to reverse. So you're going to reach back as far as you can, reach around, bring your biceps next to your ear, and then come back down to the starting position. And as I'm sure you're feeling, it's easy to rotate that trunk, so we want to keep that trunk square so all this movement's coming through the shoulder joint. And again, this is where that irradiation comes from. We want to keep that tension in the whole arm, so all of that energy goes through the shoulder. All right, last one on this side. And again, if you get a little bit of pinchiness, just back off the range and continue through in a pain-free range. Good. Let's go ahead and switch sides. So I'll just change angles so you can see a different angle. Again, making a fist, thumb pointing back to start. You're going to reach up. Once you can't go any further, you're going to rotate that thumb back again, and then reach back and reverse. Trying to get that full rotational range. Another common compensation is to lean back once you can't get any more what we call shoulder flexion. So again, take note of that. Try to keep everything moving smoothly and focused on the shoulder joint. All right, now we're going to move on to those shoulder blades. So common in the fitness world is to, shoulder blades down and back, but they are meant to move. So we want to restore some of that movement, that glide on the rib cage, so that we can get better, essentially shoulder movement and trunk movement by having those shoulder blades actually move along the rib cage. So we'll go in a seated position, or if you're comfortable in kneeling, you can stay there. You're going to place your arms out so they're parallel to the ground. Again, we're going to make some fists to keep the tension, keep those elbows straight. From here, we're going to shrug our shoulder blades up towards our ears, and then pull the shoulder blades back, keeping them shrugged. Then we'll pull them down towards our back pockets, and then punch them forward so we get a nice stretch across the back, the upper back. Just continue throughout that range. And I like to think about almost like the wheels of a train. They stay parallel. We're not lifting up or down. We're keeping it parallel. Just the distance between the ground and the arm changes. And they might start kind of square, trying to get every little nook and cranny. And then as you get more comfortable, you can kind of make it a little bit more smooth. Let's go ahead and switch directions. Give that a little shake out. We're going to move on to just our elbows and wrists. So we'll start with our right elbow. You're going to rotate. Again, I want you to keep a fist or a straight hand, but the wrist stays still in this movement. So we're going to start by bending our elbow and rotating our palm away from us. Good. And then we're going to rotate our palm down or towards us, and then straighten the elbow. So rotate the palm away or palm up as we bend the elbow, and then rotate towards as we straighten. One more like that. And then we'll switch directions. So we'll start palm down as we bend the elbow. Rotate palm up, and then straighten the elbow. And notice I'm not moving through my wrist and I'm not moving through my shoulder. So it can be helpful to kind of think about that shoulder down and back, so that all this movement is coming through just my elbow. Good. Let's switch over to the other side. So again, rotate that palm up and away as we bend, and then rotate down and towards as we straighten. Again, you can do this with a fist or a flat hand. And if you're finding that you're rotating through the shoulder, you can even put your hand on your biceps to just give yourself some feedback. And then we'll switch directions. So bend the elbow with the palm down and straighten with the palm up. Good. So we'll move on to the wrist. Again, you can have a flat hand or a fist, whatever you're more comfortable with. I like to grab my forearm of the opposite side, just so that I make sure I don't move through the elbow. And I'm just going to draw basically a circle with my knuckles, or as if I'm trying to dig a hole as big as I can with just my knuckles. The wrist is not a smooth joint. There's multiple joints that make up the wrist. And so you might get some little snaps and cracks. That's all normal. But again, we want to stay in that pain-free range. And then let's switch directions. If you find there's an area where you want to kind of rush through, or it's more challenging to get through, I usually say speed hides need. So if we want to rush through it or it drops very quickly, see if you can consciously slow it down and try to gain some control in that range. Good, let's switch sides. And again, we can play with intensity by how hard we're squeezing, how much tension we're creating in our body. And just remember, if our goal is just to maintain, or what we call kind of like your daily flossing, go ahead and switch directions. Maybe you're only working at like 30 to 40%. If you're doing this as a warm-up or as a kind of a recovery strategy, maybe you're more in that 50 to 70% range. Or if you're really wanting to create that tension to increase your range of motion over time, then you're working at that kind of 75 and up range. Keep in mind, when we're working at those higher intensities, it's very neurologically fatiguing. So it might not feel like you're doing a lot, but the nervous system is trying to learn new things. So you might find that you're more fatigued, or even that you have some muscle soreness the following day. All right, we're going to move on to the spine. So I prefer this one in a kneeling position. If you're comfortable here, you can go tall kneeling or you can go seated. You're going to give yourself a big hug. And the key here is to keep your pelvis stacked. So you're not leaning forward and back. All the movement comes through the spine and not the hips. So you're going to give yourself a hug. You're going to tuck your chin towards your chest and curl down, elbows towards your belly, trying to curl yourself into a ball. Once you can't go any further without leaning over, you're going to start that rotation. So you're going to rotate and side bend towards the right, again without leaning. And then you're going to arch back, again without leaning. So thinking about tucking that pelvis or tilting that pelvis forward and arching the back versus leaning back. Imagine you have a string pulling you from the top of your head towards the ceiling, and you're staying on that string, you're just bending the string. And then rotating that left side towards the left, and then tucking back into your ball. Let's switch directions. So rolling over to the left, extending up as much as you can. You can lift those elbows to get a little bit more through the upper back, and then rolling over to the right side and coming back down into your ball. One more in each direction. Trying to find every little nook and cranny of that spine. Again, staying in pain-free range. Good. Now we'll come down into all fours, and we're going to go into what we call segmental cat-cow. So again, working on the spine, but in flexion extension only. So you're going to start with your shoulders stacked over your wrist, your hips stacked over your knees. Your toes can be tucked under if you want a nice little stretch on the bottom of your feet, or you can keep them flat. And we're going to start at the pelvis. So I want you to think about your pelvis as a bowl, and we're going to tilt that bowl forward. So belly button comes towards the floor. And then thinking one at a time, you're trying to sink your vertebrae towards the floor. Once you get to the chest, I want you to think about an arrow coming through your chest and you're pointing it to the wall in front of you. And then head and neck come last. And then reverse, chin to chest. Press the floor away from you. Think about curling yourself into a ball again. But pelvis comes last, so you're still sticking that tailbone up towards the ceiling. And then only once you get there, tuck that pelvis under. Think about your belt buckle pointing up towards your rib cage. And reverse. So tilt that pelvis forward again, spill that bowl of water out in front of you. Sink that belly button down towards the floor, sink that chest towards the floor, and then point that heart up towards the front wall, head and neck come last, and reverse. Tuck your chin towards your chest, Think about curling yourself into a ball in order, ending with the pelvis. One more time. Think about nice and slow and controlled. Might feel a little shaky. Because again, you're asking your body to do something it might not be used to, or at least with this much control. Good. All right, we're going to move on to hip cars. So we're going to do the side lying today. You're going to lie on, let's start on your right side all together. And if you want, you can place a ball of socks or a washcloth or a ball behind your knee to create a little bit of tension. It's not needed, but you're welcome to. Either way, I want you to make sure you're stable in your positioning, ribs stacked over the pelvis, and then squeeze your heel towards your bum, so you feel a little bit of engagement in your hamstrings. From here, you're going to bring your knee up towards your chest, and then open up your hip to the side. From here, we're going to do internal rotation of the hip, so you're going to rotate so the outside of your ankle is moving away from your body. Once you can't go any further, then I want you to drive your heel back. Make sure your knee still stays bent, squeezing the bum, trying to get hip extension. Key here is not to let your back arch, so keep that pelvis tucked, belt buckle to the rib cage, and then come back down to your starting position. Now we're going to reverse. So you're going to drive that heel back, and then lift that knee over as if you're trying to reach over a hurdle, bringing your knee up towards your chest. And back down. Good, one more. Knee towards the chest, open up the hip. You can even press your arm and your bottom leg into the ground to create a bit more tension. You're going to rotate in internally, so ankle comes away, and then drive that heel back, squeeze the bum. Come back down to the start and reverse. Good. All right, we'll switch sides. So again, find your side position. Make sure you're stacked and facing forward and not up towards the ceiling. Ribs and pelvis are finding that canister position so you can breathe three-dimensionally. You're going to squeeze your heel towards your bum so you feel that hamstring working. And then bring that knee up towards the chest. Open up the hip. Again, only as so far that I'm not moving through my trunk or pelvis. All the movement comes through my hip. Then I'm going to internally rotate so my foot comes away from the body. Drive that heel back and come back to the start. And reverse. Drive that heel back. Reach around as if I'm lifting over a hurdle, and come back to the start. And one more each direction. Again, if I want to make this more challenging, I just squeeze my heel towards my bum a little bit more, and you'll feel how much more energy and tension that creates in the hip musculature. Good. All right, we'll come back into a seated position. We're going to move on to the lower leg. So starting with the knee, you're going to sit with your knee bent and your heel on the floor. And I want you to imagine there's a screw attaching your heel to the floor, but it rotates. You're going to flex your foot up towards the shin, and that will lock out the ankle joint. And then I want you to imagine there's an arrow coming out of the front of your knee. And we're going to rotate through that screw so that the arrow points to the right, and then so the arrow points to the left. And the ankle's going to move, but I don't want you to move through the ankle. So this stays locked, hip stays locked, and we're just moving through the knee. This one's a little trickier, so if you don't get it right away, that's okay. You can also use your hands to encourage that motion. But just take note, even if it's little subtle movements, try not to move through the ankle or through the hip. Let's switch over to the other side. So again, that arrow's coming out of the front of the shin. Your heel stays on the ground, foot flexed up towards the shin, so you should feel a bit of a burning sensation on the front of the shin to start. And then we're going to rotate in and out. And it's okay if it's a little subtle, and we typically have less internal rotation, so when the foot turns in, then external rotation. Okay, if there's a difference between the two, we're just trying to achieve as much as we can on both sides. All right, the last controlled articular rotation we're going to do is for the ankle. So you can bring your knee in towards your chest, or your thigh into your chest, or whatever is comfortable for you. Those are just two ways you can try and minimize the movement through the knee. You're going to imagine that pencil coming out of your big toe, and you're going to do ankle circles to try and draw the biggest circle you can with your big toe. And you can add the toes into this, so as your toe comes up towards your shin, you can kind of try and spread them and extend them. And then as your toe points down towards the floor, you can curl all of your toes under. Similar to the wrist, there's multiple joints that make up the ankle, so it's not going to feel super smooth. And then let's reverse. This is a common one where many of us have had ankle sprains and maybe lack control in some areas. So if you find yourself kind of rushing through a space, take note, see if you can intentionally slow it down. All right, let's switch sides. So again, keeping the knee still, hip still, and imagining that big pencil coming out of your big toe. Drawing that circle, or I like to always say, as if you're trying to scrape that last bit of peanut butter out of the jar. And then let's switch directions. Again, you might get some cracks or pops or tendons kind of flicking over. That's all normal. But again, if you do have any pain, just back off the range. Good. All right. So the last thing we're going to go through today is to focus really on controlling both sides of a joint. So it's pretty common for people to feel really tight in their hamstrings, and to stretch and stretch and stretch their hamstrings and never feel any more flexible or less tight in their hamstrings. And sometimes that's because the regressive angle or regressive tissue, so the tissue on the opposite side, isn't strong enough or doesn't have control and range. So when we do our stretches, we want to incorporate isometric, which means engaging without moving, contractions to our stretches to help reinforce the range that we've just achieved. So we'll we'll do this for the hamstrings today, but you can apply this concept to any stretch. We'll start in a modified hurdle position, or if you have access to a doorway or a strap, you can kind of lie on your back with your leg up in the air. It is important when we're doing our stretches and our mobility that we have good alignment, because we're going to achieve that mobility in that position that we train. So we want to try and find those sit bones and sit up nice and tall. If this is too much for you, you can put a block or a stack of books under your hips so that you're not rounding through the low back. You're able to sit tall because we want the stretch to come through the hamstrings, not the low back. From here, we want to make sure our ribs and pelvis are stacked, and then we're going to hinge over as much as we can until we feel a stretch in the meaty part of the back of the leg. If you feel it in your knee, I want you to bend your knee a little bit so that you're getting it more in the muscle tissue and less in the tendon. So from here, we're just going to hold this for about 30 seconds. Again, use any props you need to get yourself comfortable in this position. If we're not comfortable in a position, our body's going to fight us. Our nervous system's going to restrict going into a position where it's not comfortable in, because that's where it fears it might get injured. So the whole purpose of mobility training is to be able to relax and then increase strength and control in a position so we can access that in our activities. From here, I'm going to dig my heel into the ground, straight down, but then also pull without moving my heel towards my bum. So I should feel a little bit more engagement in my hamstring from here. I'm going to hold for about 10 seconds. And similar to our other drills, we can change the intensity based on our goal or our experience. So maybe we go about 50 to 60%. Or if this is something you've done before, you can increase that intensity a bit. From here, you're going to relax, and instead of relaxing into the stretch, I want you to actively pull yourself deeper into the stretch. So you're not just going to bring your trunk towards your thigh. I want you to actively think about bringing your thigh towards your trunk. And if it's helpful, you can place your hand in your hip crease, and I want you to try and crush it. Crush your hand. I want you to think about squeezing your hand between your thigh and your trunk. And that's going to engage those hip flexors, which allow us to actively fold into a deeper position in our hamstrings. And relax. Find those sit bones again, make sure you're stacked, and then hinge over a little bit more if you can. Again, we want the stretch in the meaty part, so keep your knees softly bent if you need to. And we're going to do one more round of that. So you're going to drive your heel into the floor, almost like you're curling it towards you, like you're trying to make a divot in the floor. So this is called PALS, or progressive angular isometric loading. Our progressive tissue is the one that's being stretched. And then relax and actively pull yourself deeper into the stretch, almost like you're trying to hover your leg off the ground, squeeze the quad, actively pull your quad towards your trunk, trunk towards your quad. And this is our rails, our regressive angular isometric loading. Regressive meaning the opposite tissue of the tissue that's being stretched. We need strength in our regressive tissue to be able to access length in our progressive tissue. And relax. Let's move over to the other side. So same thing, find your sit bones nice and tall. Use a prop or two if you need to. Find your rib stack first, get that three-dimensional breathing, and then we'll just hinge over until you feel stretch in that meaty part of the hamstring. And at this point, you want that relaxation. So think about that three-dimensional breathing. Think about that relaxation in the tissue. tissue. But when we work on our pales and rails contractions, we might want to create a little bit more tension. So we're creating more intensity, more load through the tissue we're trying to strengthen. So a couple more breaths here. And then start with our progressive or pales contractions. So drive your heel into the floor and curl it towards your bum without bending that knee. So you feel that engagement in the back of the leg. And then relax, actively pull yourself deeper into the stretch. Squeeze that quad, let that leg hover off the ground. Think about crushing an orange between your thigh and trunk. Actively pull yourself deeper into the stretch. You can use your hands for support, but I want you to use your hip flexor tissue to pull yourself into this position. And relax. Deep breath out. See if you can hinge a little bit deeper. It's okay if you can't. And one more round. Driving heel down first. Keep breathing. Good. And reverse. Squeeze, squeeze, squeeze. Again, you can create more tension in your body if you want to increase the intensity of this drill. Straighten that leg, squeeze the thigh, and then actively lift your thigh towards your trunk. Actively pull your trunk towards your thigh. 3, 2, 1, and let go. Something to keep in mind with mobility as well is if we have a huge gap between what we call our passive range of motion, so where you can get there with support, and our active range, that increases our injury risk and decreases performance. So we want to try and close that gap. If you find when you do these contractions, you get a lot more range each time, you likely have a great opportunity to increase your strength and control by working more of that end range. So not only just achieving through that neurological reset, telling the nervous system it's comfortable getting in that position, but then reinforcing it through different activities, such as for the hamstrings, maybe a straight leg deadlift. So there's different ways to then reinforce what we're doing in mobility in other classes and activities. The other thing I'll just note is if you have any pinching or pain, as I said, you can back off the range. If the pain is on what we call the open angle side, so you feel kind of a stretch, usually that's okay to work through. If it's on the closing angle, so the angle that's getting shorter and it's kind of pinchy, that's when you might want to get the support of a manual therapist to help get that joint moving a little bit better. All right, thank you for joining me, and I look forward to seeing you again.